The lanterns were still burning when I woke. Their glow trembled against the window pane, flickering like a heart that hadn't realized it had stopped. Outside, the fog was folding itself over the yard, soft, gray, endless. Elias's side of the bed was cold. I thought he might have gone to fetch more firewood, or to calm his nerves, as he often did when the sea grew too loud. But the house? It felt wrong. Still, heavy, like it was listening for something that didn't come. The wedding had ended hours ago, though the laughter still hung in the air like perfume. We'd danced until the candles wept, until the waves below the cliffs swallowed the music whole. Elias had been quiet that night, smiling, but not the way he used to. He'd kept touching the ring on his finger, twisting it like it didn't fit. When I asked if he was all right, he just said, "The fog's thicker than usual tonight." Then he looked toward the well, that old stone mouth at the edge of the yard. And I swear, his eyes dimmed. I poured water from the basin and tried to shake off the feeling. The house smelled of sea salt and wilted flowers. The table was still covered in plates from the night before. Crumbs, half-drunk wine, a single petal floating in a cup. It should have been the happiest morning of my life. But something in me already knew. He wasn't coming back. When the sun finally dragged itself through the fog, I went outside. The grass was wet, silvered with dew. The air was so still I could hear the ocean breathing, and then I saw them, his boots. Standing neatly beside the old well, side by side, as if he'd stepped out of them and walked straight into the dark. They weren't muddy, not like they should have been after last night's rain. The leather looked damp, though, as if touched by the sea. I called his name, once, twice, my voice disappearing into the fog. The well's stones were slick with moss. I peered down, but all I saw was darkness and a faint reflection of my own face, wavering. The air above it smelled of iron, and beneath the sound of the waves, I thought I heard something else. A whisper, low and rhythmic, like someone murmuring from below. I stumbled back, my heart racing, telling myself it was the wind. But the wind doesn't call your name that softly. By noon, the neighbors had gathered. They came in small groups carrying casseroles, condolences, and rumors. "Cold feet," one woman said. "Men like him don't settle easy," said another. The sheriff came last, Sheriff Hale. A tall man, polite in the way that hides something. He stood near the well and stared down longer than anyone else. Then he looked at me and asked, "Did he have reason to leave, ma'am?" I shook my head, but then I remembered, the night before, when the lanterns dimmed, Elias had pressed my hand too tightly and whispered, "If anything happens, stay away from the well." At the time, I thought he was just tired. Now those words looped in my mind like a song I couldn't turn off. Hale asked if Elias had enemies. I said no, but my voice cracked on the word. He nodded, took off his hat, and told me they'd searched the cliffs. When he left, I stayed by the well. The fog had lifted by then, but the air still felt heavy, like it was holding something. I knelt beside those boots, tracing the creases in the leather. They were warm once, I thought. They carried him here, and then quietly, they didn't. That night I couldn't sleep. The house groaned as the tide came in, pressing against the cliffs. From the window I could see the well, a pale circle in the moonlight. I should have looked away. But just before dawn I saw it, the faint shimmer of movement near the stones. And then I heard it again, that same whisper, curling through the fog. It sounded like my name, but softer. I went to the door, hand trembling on the latch. The air outside smelled of salt and something older, something the sea refused to bury. I thought about the boots, about Elias's last words. "If the well calls, don't answer." But the voice was so gentle, so familiar, like love trying to find its way home. I stepped out into the fog, and the door closed behind me. The yard still smelled like roses. Not the fresh kind, the kind that had been trampled under dancing feet in rain. Wax from the wedding candles had hardened in pale puddles across the tables, and ribbons hung limp in the damp air. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was the cold. The second was the silence. It wasn't the gentle kind that follows joy. It was hollow, like the house had swallowed its own voice. Elias's side of the bed was untouched, and in the corner, the lantern we'd left burning flickered once, and died. The morning light came slow, stretching across the floorboards, silver and thin. I sat there, half-dressed, listening for footsteps. He always rose early, always started the kettle before me. But the fire was out. Even the birds were quiet, as if they too were waiting for him. The wedding had been simple, soft music, faces we trusted, laughter that melted into the sea breeze. We'd promised each other peace, not grandness. He'd whispered it to me as we danced. No more storms, Clara, just calm seas from now on. But the sea never listens to vows. When I stepped outside, fog wrapped around my legs like something alive. The garden lights were still glowing faintly, their wires dripping. The sky hadn't decided what color it wanted to be yet. Gray, maybe blue, maybe both. I remember the sound of my own breathing, steady but too loud, and the faint hum of the waves breaking against the cliffs below. Everything smelled of salt and smoke and wilted flowers. Then I saw them, his boots, side by side. At the edge of the old well, they didn't belong there. Elias never left them outside, said the leather would crack. But there they were, still damp, perfectly placed, like someone had set them there with care. I called his name. Once, then again. Only the sea answered. I moved closer. The grass was slick beneath my feet, cold as glass. The well looked different in daylight, smaller maybe, but deeper somehow. The stones were slick with moss, the rope tied neatly around the beam, swaying just slightly. My reflection trembled on the surface of the water. It didn't look like me. It looked like someone else wearing my face. Someone who already knew what had happened. I leaned in, whispered his name again, softer this time. And I swear I heard it echo back, not clearly, just enough to make my throat close. I reached for the boots. The leather was cold, heavy. Inside, the soles were dry. No footprints around them, no sign he'd walked away. Just boots. And air. Behind me, a crow screamed from the fence post, sharp and sudden. I startled, dropped one of the boots. It landed with a soft thud, and from below something shifted in the water. A ripple that shouldn't have been there. By afternoon, the whole town knew. They always do. They came to the house in small clusters, the women with casseroles, the men with folded arms and pity. The smell of boiled potatoes and grief filled the air. Mrs. Arlen, my neighbor, touched my shoulder. "He'll come home," she said, but her eyes flicked toward the well when she said it. Like she didn't believe her own words. Another woman, someone I barely knew, whispered to the baker's wife. "He's his father's son, after all. You remember what happened to old Samuel Whitlow?" I pretended not to hear, but every whisper settled somewhere inside me, heavy as ash. When Sheriff Hale arrived, the murmurs stopped. He was tall, quiet, his uniform creased sharp as a blade. He asked me when I'd last seen Elias. "After the music ended," I said. He said he needed a walk. "Just a minute of quiet." Hale nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. Did he seem troubled? I thought of his hand on mine during the vows. Trembling, like something was waiting for him even then. I thought of how he kept looking at the well that night, just before the fog rolled in. And I thought of the way he kissed my forehead, too long, too still. But I said, no, he seemed fine. The sheriff crouched near the well, ran a finger along the stone. "Old place," he said. "How deep?" "Too deep," I answered. He didn't smile. He just tipped his hat and said he'd be back when the tide changed. When the last visitor left, the sun had already begun to bleed into the fog. I sat on the steps, Elias's boots beside me, staring at the line where the land met the sea. Somewhere out there, gulls screamed into the wind. And for a moment, I thought I heard him among them, not crying out, but calling me home. That night, the house was darker than it had ever been. The oil lamp flickered low and the shadows stretched long across the walls. I couldn't bring myself to close the window. The fog slid in through the cracks, soft as breath. I kept the boots by the door, the way he always did, ready for morning. But when I lay down, the silence pressed so hard against my chest I could barely breathe. Sometime near dawn, I woke to a sound. A faint rhythm, steady and familiar. Footsteps. Not loud, not hurried. Just the sound of someone crossing the yard. I sat up, heart pounding, staring through the thin curtain. But the fog was too thick to see through. The steps stopped near the well. Then nothing, only the sea. When the sun rose, the yard was empty again. Except the boots, no longer by the door. They were back where I'd found them. Side by side. By the well, I didn't move them this time. I just watched them until the fog swallowed them whole. And somewhere beneath the sound of the waves, I could have sworn I heard him whisper my name. The fog hadn't lifted by afternoon. It clung to the trees, to the stones, to my breath. From the window, the yard looked softer than it was, the kind of softness that hides sharp things underneath. The well sat in the middle of it all, still, waiting. I told myself I wouldn't go near it again. But by the time the clock struck 2, I was already standing there, my hands trembling, my reflection breaking apart in the water like it didn't want to stay with me. It had been 2 days since Elias disappeared. The town had stopped asking questions out loud, but I could still feel them, in the way the grocer's wife stared too long, in how the mailman left letters without looking toward the house. I'd buried myself in chores, trying to keep the silence from swallowing me. The rhythm of the broom, the scrape of dishes, the low hum of the wind outside, all of it pretending to be normal. But every sound led back to the same thing. The well, I'd grown up hearing stories about it. Children dared each other to drop stones down its throat and wait for the echo. Some said it was bottomless, that it reached the sea beneath the cliffs. Others said it kept what it took. Elias never liked to talk about it. He'd laugh when the neighbors told tales, but his laugh always came late, like it had to climb through something first. Once, long before the wedding, he'd said, "Some things in this town never stay buried." Then he'd changed the subject. Now, standing at its edge, I wondered if this was what he'd meant. The rope that hung over the well had frayed from years of weather. I touched it, feeling the rough fibers press into my fingers. It smelled faintly of rust and rain. When I looked down, the water was darker than I remembered, almost black, the kind of black that doesn't reflect light, only swallows it. My face appeared for a moment, rippling, divided, 2 eyes, 2 mouths, none of them quite mine. The air was thick with the scent of salt and something else, something metallic, sharp, iron, the kind of smell that lingers on tools or blood. I called his name, just once. The sound fell in slow like a stone, nothing. Then, faintly, something moved. The water quivered. A sound rose up, not loud, not distinct. Just a whisper, too human to be the wind. I stepped back, my breath catching. It was almost like hearing someone murmur through a door, the words too soft to understand but heavy with meaning. "Elias?" I whispered. The whisper came again, shorter this time, closer. My heart pounded so hard it drowned everything else. I wanted to run, but my feet stayed planted, as if the earth had taken hold of them. The well was breathing. I could hear it. A low inhale, a pause, an exhale that fogged the air above the stones. I blinked, and for one brief, trembling second, I thought I saw movement beneath the surface. Something pale. Something watching. A sound broke behind me. The creak of a gate, the crunch of a step on gravel. I turned, but no one was there. The fog had thickened, wrapping the yard in white cloth. "Clara?" The voice was familiar. For a moment, I thought it was him. But then a figure came into view. Mavis, the widow from down the road, her gray shawl pulled tight. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. Her eyes flicked to the well. "It's bad to linger near that thing. Brings up what ought to stay down." I tried to smile, but my face didn't remember how. "I heard something," I whispered. From inside. Mavis looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped forward, laid her hand on the stones. Her fingers traced the rim like she was feeling for something long lost. It's only the wind, she said. The well carries it from the sea. Makes it sound like words sometimes. But when she looked at me again, her eyes were wet. She didn't believe what she was saying. I asked her, has anyone ever gone missing here? Her lips pressed together. She hesitated, then said, not in my lifetime. But the stories go back further than that. She glanced toward the water again. They say the well keeps voices, that it remembers. The fog drifted between us, thin and cold. She turned to leave, her boots crunching softly on the path. Before she disappeared into the white, she said, if you love him, don't call his name down there again. After she left, I stood there for a long time, unable to move. The wind picked up, rustling the grass, rattling the old gate. From somewhere far below, a single drop of water echoed. Slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The lantern I'd brought flickered, its flame shrinking small and nervous. The smell of iron grew stronger, and I thought of the tools Elias used. His saw, his nails, his hands rough with work. The whisper rose again, softer now. So soft it could have been memory. But this time, it didn't sound like my name. It sounded like laughter. I stepped back until the edge of the porch met my heels. My dress caught the wind, brushing against my legs. The boots, his boots, still sat by the well, their leather gleaming wet. For a moment, I thought I saw water inside them. Just a shimmer, then it was gone. I turned away, forcing myself toward the door, telling myself it was grief, that grief can make anything whisper if you stand still long enough. But as I closed the door behind me, I could still hear it. A voice, faint and steady, rising through the boards, calling from the deep. Clara. I didn't answer. Not that time, but I listened, and I shouldn't have. The rain had stopped by the time Sheriff Hale came. The yard was still slick with it, puddles like mirrors, collecting pieces of gray sky. He stepped over the broken petals and damp ribbons from the wedding, careful not to look too long at the house. I remember how his hat dripped when he took it off, how he spoke my name softly, almost like an apology. And still, behind that politeness, there was something else. A watching. Like he'd already decided this story wasn't going to end well for me. The parlor smelled of lavender and rainwater. I'd lit a small fire to keep the cold from settling too deep, but the room still felt hollow, like sound couldn't fill it anymore. He sat in Elias's chair, the one by the window. His hands were large, the skin darkened by sun, and when he opened his notebook, I noticed how careful he was not to touch the lace on the table. Mrs. Whitlow, he said, and it stung hearing that name. Only 12 hours ago, I'd signed it on the marriage register. He asked when I last saw Elias. What we spoke about before he left. Whether there'd been any quarrels, his tone never broke rhythm, calm even, practiced. But I could feel the questions coiling around something he wasn't saying outright. When I told him about the boots by the well, his pen stopped moving. He asked what kind of soil we had here. Mostly dry, I said. Clay when it rains, he nodded. Then said, almost to himself, then the mud on them ain't from here. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the house, a door shifted in its frame, and I realized he'd already been told something I hadn't. He walked me out to the porch, the boards creaking under our steps. The world smelled of wet earth and smoke. He crouched beside the boots, still there, just as I'd left them. The leather dark and shining, the soles marked with something thick, reddish-brown. Not quite clay, not quite blood. You mind if I take these? He asked. I shook my head. He wrapped them carefully in burlap, like they were something sacred. Then he turned to me again, his eyes narrowed but not unkind. Ma'am, was there anyone who might have wanted to see your husband that night? I started to answer, but the words tangled. He waited. There was a man, I said finally. From before? Someone who came to town 2 weeks ago. The sheriff's pen clicked softly. What kind of man? I hesitated. The kind Elias didn't like to talk about. For a moment, the silence between us felt thick enough to touch. The wind moved through the well rope, making it groan. When I turned back to the house, something caught my eye. A drawer, half open on the writing desk. Paper curled inside, a letter addressed to me. In his handwriting, but unopened. That night, after the sheriff left, I sat by the lamplight with the letter in my lap. The envelope was creased, the seal smudged, like it had been carried for days. My name, Clara, written in the way he only used when he was trying to make peace. I thought of his voice, low and careful. Of how, before the ceremony, he'd stood by the window instead of coming to sit beside me. How he'd said, "Sometimes love has a way of finding out who we really are." I'd smiled then, not understanding. Now the words made my chest ache. I traced the edge of the letter, trying to decide if opening it would change something I wasn't ready to face. What could he have written, before the vows, before the disappearance? And why seal it, only to keep it hidden among his things? The clock ticked, steady and patient. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters. Every creak of the house felt like breath. When I lifted the letter to the flame, I half hoped it would catch, that I'd be spared whatever truth was inside. But the paper stayed still, untouched. So I slid my finger under the seal. Inside was one page. Blank. Except for 4 words, written at the bottom in that same slanted hand. "I'm sorry for before." Before what? The question wouldn't leave me. I placed the letter back on the desk, beside his photograph. The oil lamp flickered, catching the edge of his smile. That uncertain one. The kind he wore when he didn't want me to ask questions. Outside, the well rope creaked again. A steady rhythm, almost like someone breathing. I closed the window, but the sound followed. In the silence that came after, I whispered his name. Just once. The floorboards sighed. A soft thud echoed from somewhere near the porch. I froze. The house, the fields, the night, all listening. I told myself it was the wind. That grief could make anything sound human. But when I looked back at the letter, the lamp flame bent, as though someone had just walked past, and for the first time I wondered if Elias was truly gone. The flame trembled before I did. It was the only light in the house, a small flicker swallowed by shadows that seemed to listen. The letter lay on the table between my hands, untouched, heavy with something more than ink. I could still hear the wind pressing against the shutters, the faint groan of the rope outside. The same rope tied to the well. I thought of Elias's boots by its edge, still wet from somewhere that wasn't here. And as the wax seal cracked beneath my thumb, I swear the night leaned closer. It had been 3 days since the wedding. The roses were brown now, their scent thick and sickly in the corners of the house. I hadn't lit a fire since the sheriff left. The silence felt cleaner without it. I'd spent the morning washing the lace from my dress, trying to scrub the soil from the hem. But no matter how many times I rinsed it, the fabric smelled faintly of iron, like the well water. That night, I found the courage to sit with the letter again. The envelope was worn soft at the corners, like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. Elias's handwriting ran crooked across the front, careful but hurried. I thought of how his hand trembled when he slipped the ring onto mine. How he'd whispered, "Some things in this town never stay buried," before the music began. Everyone else had clapped. Only I had seen the fear in his eyes. The candle popped, pulling me back to the present. I took a breath, then another, and broke the seal. The paper inside was thin, nearly translucent in the candlelight. The ink bled in places where the pen must have hesitated, where his hand must have shaken. "Clara," it began. Just my name. No greeting. No love. Then a single line. "I'm sorry for the things I didn't tell you." My pulse slowed as I read on. "If the well calls, don't answer." I stared at those words until they blurred. The ink dipped suddenly, as if the pen had fallen. The rest of the page was empty. That was it. No explanation. No goodbye. Just that one warning written like a prayer. I felt my throat tighten. What did he mean if the well calls? I thought back to the night he disappeared. The fog, the faint hum that rose from the fields. How the air seemed to move without wind. I'd heard it then too. A sound like whispering water, though the well had always been still. The candle flickered hard, and I turned toward the window. For a moment I thought I saw movement, something pale along the edge of the yard. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Only the well rope swaying in the dark. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his handwriting. Those uneven words looping and breaking, like breath caught mid-sentence. If the well calls, don't answer. At some point, I must have drifted off in the chair, because I woke to the sound of dripping, slow, measured, like water falling from a height. I followed it down the hall. The air grew colder with each step. The back door was open, moving just enough to whisper against the frame. Outside, the mist had settled again, thick and low. Curling around the grass, the well stood at the far edge of the yard, the rope swaying gently. Drip, drip. Something shone along the stones. Not water, but something thinner. Something that looked too much like skin. I stopped. Then, faintly, from the mouth of the well, came a sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rope, it was a voice. So soft I almost missed it. My name. I took one step closer. Then another, Elias. The fog shifted, thickened, and as if drawing breath. But the voice didn't return, only the steady echo of water falling from somewhere unseen. I backed away, every part of me trembling. I shut the door, bolted it, and leaned my forehead against the wood. The house was silent again. But I could still hear him, calling from somewhere I couldn't reach. That night, I dreamed of the well. It wasn't stone anymore. It was open water, endless, shining beneath a gray sky. And from its depths, hands reached upward, pale, wrinkled, slow, as if they'd been waiting a long time to be found. Elias stood among them, his boots gone, his shirt torn by the wind. He didn't speak. He only looked at me, with those same eyes from our wedding morning. Afraid. When I woke, the candle had burned to its base. The letter was gone. Only a wet ring marked the table where it had been, as if the paper had melted back into water. I stared at it until dawn. And when the first light touched the window pane, I thought I heard it again, a voice, faint and low, calling my name. The knock came just before dusk. 3 slow taps against the door, like someone uncertain whether to be heard. When I opened it, the fog had already crept up from the cliffs, curling around the porch rails. An old woman stood there, wrapped in a shawl the color of rain. In her hands, she held a small brass lantern. Its glass was clouded, but when she lifted it, the last bit of daylight caught inside it, flickering like something still alive. "Mavis," I whispered. I hadn't seen her since Elias's funeral. Except there had been no funeral. She didn't speak at first. Just looked past me into the house, her eyes moving over the walls as if she were seeing ghosts. Finally, she said, "He feared the dark." Her voice rasped like wind against dry reeds. But not for himself. She placed the lantern in my hands before I could ask what she meant. It was cold, heavier than I expected. I could smell the faint trace of oil and iron on her fingers. "He used to come to me," she murmured, "when he was a boy. Always asking about the sea, about the well." I felt a shiver work its way through me. The well? Her eyes flickered toward the back field, the place I never looked after sunset. "Some things in this town don't rest easy," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and vanished into the fog. The door creaked closed on its own, though I hadn't touched it. Inside, the lantern glowed faintly in my hands, though I hadn't lit it yet. Night came heavy. The kind that swallowed sound. I sat at the kitchen table, the lantern before me. The flame inside, if it was a flame, trembled in rhythm with my heartbeat. I remembered the letter, Elias's words still echoing in my mind. If the well calls, don't answer. But what if he wasn't warning me to stay away? What if he was calling me closer? By the time I stepped outside, the world had gone silver with mist. The air tasted of salt and rust. Each step across the field felt like moving through someone else's dream. The lantern's light wavered in the fog, casting soft shapes on the ground, like footprints that faded as soon as I saw them. When I reached the well, the air changed. It always did there, colder, quieter. The stones glistened as though the fog had been breathing on them. I set the lantern on the edge, its glow spilling down the black throat below. The rope swayed gently, though there was no wind. "Elias," I said softly. My voice fell into the dark, swallowed whole. For a moment, there was nothing, only silence. Then the water shifted, once, twice, as if something beneath had stirred. At first, I thought it was just the reflection, my face in the dark, stretched and broken by the rippling water. But the more I looked, the more I realized. It wasn't me. The eyes that looked back were darker, deeper. They blinked, the lantern flickered. The rope creaked as if something had tugged from below. I took a step back, my breath catching. "Elias?" I tried again, my voice smaller this time, uncertain. There was movement, soft, circular, like someone turning over beneath the surface. The light shimmered, bending the water into pale, trembling shapes. And then I heard it. Not a voice. A whisper. So faint it could have been the mist, or the wind through the rope, but I knew that sound. It was him. Clara. My name, drawn out like the sigh of the sea. The well seemed to pull toward me then, or maybe I leaned closer without meaning to. I wanted to see him. Just once more. The flame flared, reflected in 1,000 tiny ripples. And in the middle of them, a shape rose, pale, human, reaching upward. I stumbled back. The lantern's light dimmed suddenly, and for one breathless moment, everything went black. When I woke, I was on the ground, the grass damp beneath my palms. The lantern lay beside me, unbroken, still glowing faintly, though the wick had burned out. I crawled toward the well. The water was still again, dark as glass. Whatever had been there was gone. The only thing left was a thin trail of water leading away from the stones, winding back toward the house. It shimmered under the weak lantern glow, disappearing just before the porch steps. I looked back at the well once more. And that's when I saw it. Inside the glass of the lantern, behind the faint light, was a reflection that wasn't mine. A man's face, wet, eyes open, watching me. The flame inside shivered once, then went out, and in the dark that followed, the well began to whisper again. The morning light didn't reach the cellar door. It just hovered there, soft, reluctant, like it knew better than to go inside. Sheriff Hale stood on the porch, his hat in his hands. He wasn't a man who lingered, but that day he did. "There's something you should know, Mrs. Clay," he said, eyes fixed on the gravel. His boots were muddy, the kind of mud that came from down near the cliffs. I remember the sound of the wind in the chimney. Hollow, uncertain. That was the moment I stopped pretending the house didn't have a heartbeat of its own. He told me about the tunnels, the ones buried beneath the town like veins, twisting under fields and houses, all the way to the sea. Old smugglers used them, he said. Whiskey, gunpowder, whatever would fit through the dark. He paused. Looked at me then. One runs under your land, under the well. His words sank slow, heavy as stones. After he left, I stayed on the porch. The horizon was thin and cold. Crows circled near the cliffs, slow and deliberate. I thought about Elias, how he'd always walked with a lantern, even at noon. How he'd paced at night, counting steps between the well and the back fence. I hadn't asked why. You don't ask questions when love is trying to keep something quiet, but when I went inside, the air felt different. The clock ticked too loudly. The floorboards whispered beneath my feet. I stood before the cellar door, the one Elias kept locked with an old brass latch. The key still hung beside it, dusty and forgotten. I turned it, slowly. The latch gave a tired sigh, as if it had been waiting. The cellar smelled of damp wood and something older. Salt, maybe. The lantern I carried shivered with each step, throwing trembling shadows across the stone walls. At first it was just shelves, tools, jars of preserves long gone to dust. But then I saw them, papers pinned to the wall in neat rows, maps, drawings, lines looping like rivers through the earth. Elias's handwriting filled the margins, measurements, notes, arrows pointing toward places I didn't recognize. One map was larger than the rest. He'd drawn the whole town, every road, every yard. Beneath it, the tunnels wound in black ink, branching deep under the ground. And then there was the red. A single route traced in crimson, the lines darker where his hand must have pressed too hard. It led from our well all the way toward the cliffs. Beside it, he'd written 2 words. "Don't go!" My hand shook as I touched the paper. The ink had bled faintly, as though it had been wet, or handled too many times. The cellar was still, but I could feel something underneath. A hum, faint as breath, like the ground itself was remembering. I took one of the sketches down, the one closest to the lantern's glow. Elias's handwriting tilted right, careful, practiced, but tired. He'd marked certain tunnels with small circles. At each one, a note. Collapsed. Unsafe. Don't return. At the bottom of the page, written smaller than the rest, was a sentence I almost missed. "The sea speaks through the stone." I read it twice, then I heard it. A sound, faint but certain, coming from the floor above. A creak, then another. I froze. The lantern flickered. It might have been the wind. Or the house. But for a moment, it felt like footsteps. Slow, measured, circling the kitchen. When I climbed back up, the kitchen was empty. Only the curtains moved, breathing with the breeze. Outside, the well stood in its circle of grass, quiet and still. But I couldn't look at it the same. If a tunnel ran beneath it, if Elias had gone down there, then maybe the dark had kept more than just his secrets. I sat by the window that night, the map spread across my lap. The red line caught the lantern's light and glowed faintly, like a vein pulsing in the dark. Before sleep, I walked out to the well. The wind carried salt from the sea, sharp and cold against my skin. The stones were damp, slick with dew. I leaned close, holding the lantern over the edge. The flame trembled, mirrored by the black water below. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw something, a shimmer, a shape, the faintest movement. But when I blinked, it was gone. Only the darkness looked back at me. Still, I whispered his name. Once. The sound fell into the deep, swallowed before it could echo. Then I turned to go. As I reached the door, the lantern flickered once, then twice, then steady again, like something had exhaled below the ground. And for the first time, I wondered if Elias's fear had never been of the dark, but of what lived beneath it. The morning rain hadn't stopped, only softened, a steady whisper against the eaves. Sheriff Hale stood by the well, his hat dark with water, his coat heavy from the walk. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Whole town's built on hollows," he said. "Old tunnels. Smugglers used them back when the sea still brought fortune." His voice carried low, almost like he didn't want the ground to hear him. When he pointed toward the house, his hand trembled slightly. "One runs under here, Mrs. Whitlow, right beneath your well." The rain fell harder after that. Or maybe the silence just grew deeper. That night I couldn't sleep. The clock ticked too loud. The walls seemed closer than before, like the house had taken a breath it couldn't let out. I made tea I didn't drink. Watched the flame in the stove bend and sway like it was thinking. Elias's coat still hung by the door, dry now, but stiff with salt. I brushed the sleeve once, and the dust left a faint print on my fingers. Sheriff Hale's words replayed in my head, slow and careful. Under your well. It didn't make sense. Elias hated the dark. He couldn't even fetch water at dusk without carrying a lantern. And yet somehow he'd been digging through it, mapping it. When I closed my eyes, I saw him bent over his desk, ink-stained fingers tracing unseen paths across paper. He must have known something he couldn't tell me. The cellar key hung on a nail by the pantry door. I hadn't touched it since the night he vanished, but as the wind pressed against the windows, I realized there'd be no rest until I did, so I took the lantern, and I went down. The cellar air was cool, metallic. It smelled of earth, iron, and something older, the scent of stone that's never seen light. The lantern flickered, stretching shadows across the walls. At first, I saw only the ordinary things: shelves lined with tools, the jars of preserves long turned to dust, the chair he used when fixing boots. Then I noticed the wall. Pinned sheets of paper covered it from floor to beam. Maps drawn by hand, edges curling, lines crossing like spider webs. Each tunnel was marked in black ink, winding beneath streets, houses, and fields. Notes crowded the margins: collapsed here, unsafe, echoes at night. My breath slowed as I traced one route with my fingertip. It began at the cliffs and wound its way inland. To our well. He'd drawn the final section in red. The line was darker there, pressed too deep, as if his hand had shaken. Beside it, in letters smaller than the rest, were 2 words: "Don't go." The ink bled faintly, as though it had once been wet, or touched by tears. I stood still for a long time, the lantern trembling in my grip. Every sound in the cellar felt amplified: the drip of water, the creak of wood, my own breathing, and underneath it all, faint and deep, something else. A hum, low and rhythmic, like the sea, but coming from the ground. I knelt beside his workbench. Dust clung to my skirt, to my fingers. Among the scattered pencils and rope, I found his old notebook, the one he always kept shut when I entered the room. The leather cover was cracked, the strap broken. Inside there were sketches of rock formations, tide measurements, bits of notes. Voices heard near the lower shaft. Wind or something else? "The well leads down further than marked." I turned the page and stopped. There, drawn in charcoal, was our house. And beneath it, a shape. Wide, coiled, almost organic. Not a tunnel. Not quite. Next to it, he'd written, "The earth remembers what we bury." I couldn't breathe for a moment. The hum deepened then, just barely, a vibration against the soles of my feet. I lifted the lantern toward the far wall. At first, I thought it was just the stone sweating with moisture. But no. The line of the floor was uneven. Something beneath the wall had been disturbed. Bricks shifted, soil collapsed inward. Elias had been digging there. Recently. I knelt, brushing away dirt. The smell rose stronger now. Salt, rust, something like old blood. I pressed my ear to the stone. For a heartbeat, I heard it again. A sound that wasn't the sea, nor the wind. It was a whisper. And though I couldn't make out the words, I swear it said my name. I sealed the lantern and stepped back, the air too thick to breathe. The cellar door felt miles away. I climbed toward it, my heart pounding to the rhythm of that whisper below. When I reached the kitchen, I turned and looked down the stairs one last time. The lantern's glow still flickered faintly through the crack, a pulse beneath the floorboards. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night was quiet, too quiet, except for the drip of water into the well. I walked to the porch, clutching his notebook to my chest. The horizon glowed faintly where the sea met the sky, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And in that stillness, I finally understood what Elias had meant to write. Not "don't go," but "don't listen," because something in this town was listening back. The first night I heard it, I thought it was the wind. Just a shift in the boards. the settling of the house. But then it came again, soft, careful, measured, footsteps, circling the house. They paused beneath the window, then moved along the porch, slow enough that I could count each step between the creaks. When I went to look, the fog was thick as milk. The kind that swallows the sound of your own breathing. Still, I knew someone was there, because the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting. The nights had turned colder since the rain, the kind of cold that sinks beneath your skin and stays. I'd taken to keeping the stove burning longer, just for the sound of it. The house felt too large without him, every corner holding something half-finished, a nail he never drove in, a cup still sitting by the sink. Outside, the sea kept its own rhythm. It moved against the cliffs, steady and deep, like a breath drawn through the earth. Sheriff Hale had come by once more. Said he'd found nothing new. Said the well was clear. When I told him about the footsteps, he smiled the way men do when they don't believe you but want to seem kind. Dreams play tricks, he said, especially when you miss someone. I didn't argue. I just nodded, watching the mist gather at the edge of the field behind him. After he left, I found Mavis waiting by the gate. She didn't speak at first, just held her shawl tighter. Then she said, quiet as the wind, "The sea takes what it's owed. Sometimes it sends a reminder first." That night, I locked the doors, but I left the lantern burning in the window, just in case it wasn't a dream. The second night, the fog came earlier. It pressed against the glass, thick and pale, until even the moon disappeared. I sat by the window wrapped in his coat. The lantern glowed beside me, its light trembling across the room. The clock ticked. The stove hummed and then faint. But certain, the steps began again. They circled the house once, twice. The boards groaned softly under weight. My breath caught when they stopped beneath the porch light. I didn't move. Didn't even blink. Through the haze I saw it, a shadow shaped like a man, tall and thin, barefooted. He stood there for what felt like a lifetime, head tilted toward the house. The lantern's flame flickered, bending toward him as though reaching. When I whispered his name, Elias, the shadow turned, and then it was gone. The night held still. Even the sea seemed to stop breathing. I didn't sleep until dawn. When the first light came, the fog was gone, the ground wet with dew. I went outside, my hands shaking. There were prints in the mud by the steps, faint, bare, and facing the house. Not away, toward. By the third night, I stopped pretending it was just in my head. I left the lantern in the window again, but this time I stayed awake beside it. The flame danced low, its reflection trembling in the glass like an eye that couldn't close. Every sound in the house became something more. The ticking clock, the sigh of the rafters, the wind moving beneath the door. Around midnight, it began, the same rhythm. The same slow, patient steps, but closer. They stopped by the well. I rose, every part of me cold. The air was damp, heavy, tasting faintly of salt. When I opened the door, the fog moved aside in slow curls. The lantern's glow spilled across the porch, onto the grass, down to the well, and there, right beside it, stood a pair of boots. His boots. Still wet, still caked with dirt, but upright, like someone had just stepped out of them. The steps began again, farther off this time. Circling toward the cliffs, I followed until I couldn't see the house anymore. The sea whispered below, restless, black as ink, and for a moment, I thought I saw him, a pale shape at the edge, staring down, unmoving. But when I blinked, there was only fog, only the sound of the waves, and a whisper that could have been my name. By morning, the lantern had gone out. The wick was cold, untouched. No sign of a draft, no sign of flame, just stillness. When I stepped outside, the boots were gone. Only 2 hollow impressions remained beside the well, filling slowly with rainwater. The fog had lifted, but the air still carried something strange, like breath held too long. Mavis came by later that day. She stood by the porch and looked toward the sea, her voice barely a murmur. "Once they start walking," she said, "they don't stop until someone answers." That night, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark instead, listening, and when the footsteps came again, circling, slow, steady, I stayed where I was because part of me knew if I opened that door, he wouldn't be standing there alone. The nights had started whispering. At first, I thought it was the sea, the way it moves when the wind shifts after sundown. But soon I realized the sound wasn't from the cliffs. It was closer, beneath the porch, along the walls. Footsteps, slow, measured. They came when the world went still, when even the stove had stopped its hum. Sometimes they paused, right beneath my window, like whoever it was could hear my heartbeat through the glass. I told myself it was nothing. But the truth was, I'd been waiting to hear them. The cold came earlier that year. It crept through the boards, through the cracks in the kitchen floor, until even my breath felt borrowed. I kept Elias's coat hanging by the door. Not because I believed he'd come back for it, but because the smell of him still lived in the fabric. Smoke, salt, the faint trace of cedar from the shed where he worked. Every night, I'd sit by the window with the lantern burning low. I told myself it was just to keep the cold away, but I think part of me hoped the light would guide him home. The sheriff had stopped by again. He always spoke gently, like you would to someone standing on thin ice. "Clara," he said, "you have to rest. The mind can make patterns out of grief." I nodded, but I didn't tell him about the shadow I'd seen, the one shaped like a man, barefoot in the fog. Later that evening, Mavis came with her shawl pulled tight, her eyes dark as the tide pools. "The sea takes what it's owed," she whispered, "and it remembers who tried to keep it waiting." After she left, I trimmed the wick of the lantern and let it burn through the night. The sound came again 2 nights later. It began as a shuffle, faint, almost shy, then settled into the same rhythm I remembered from Elias's walk. Left, right, a pause. Then another. I froze in my chair. The clock had stopped ticking, but I still heard time moving. The air seemed to pulse with each step. I went to the window, careful not to breathe too loud. Outside, the fog rolled low across the field, thick enough to hide the fences, the trees, the world beyond the yard. And there, near the well, was a shadow. It stood still at first, then moved, slow and certain, toward the porch, bare feet. I could see the prints forming in the wet earth, one after another. When it reached the steps, I felt something in the house shift, like the air itself had leaned in to listen. I whispered his name. "Elias?" The shadow stopped. It turned its head just slightly. Then, before I could blink, it dissolved into the fog. The night closed around me again. The lantern flickered once, then steadied, and in that dim light, I saw the muddy outline of a footprint on the porch, small pools of water trailing toward the door. The next morning, I found the sheriff waiting at the gate. He'd heard from one of the fishermen that I'd been walking the property at night. "Clara," he said, "you need to stop. You'll lose yourself out here." I wanted to tell him I already had, that the night had swallowed the part of me that once believed in reason. Instead, I said, there were footprints. He smiled, patient, weary. "Foxes," he said. "They come close when the fog's heavy, but foxes don't walk in circles." That evening, Mavis came again. She carried something wrapped in cloth, a handful of seashells, white and cracked. "They wash up after the sea takes someone," she murmured. "Always white, always empty." I didn't ask what she meant. That night I didn't lock the door. I left the lantern in the window, burning steady. Its light spilled across the yard, glinting off the well's edge like a thread pulling the dark apart. I waited until the fog began to move again. Slow waves across the ground. The steps returned. Closer this time. They circled once, twice, then stopped beneath the window. The lantern's flame bent sideways, as if someone were breathing against the glass. And when I looked outside, the boots were gone from the well. Morning came gray and thin. The fog had lifted, but the ground around the well was soft with prints. Too large, too deep for any fox. The boots were nowhere to be found. Only the marks where they'd stood, filling slowly with rainwater. I didn't tell the sheriff. I didn't tell Mavis. Some things belong to the dark. That night I sat by the window again, though I didn't light the lantern. The house was quiet, and the world outside was too, until I heard it again. That slow, deliberate sound, tracing the walls like a memory that hadn't yet let go. Step. Step. Pause. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark, "If it's you, come home." But only the sea answered, low, endless, and heavy with things it never gives back. The air that morning tasted of iron and salt, the kind of morning when the tide seemed to breathe heavier than usual. I carried Elias's old lantern, the one he used to take fishing before dawn. Its glass was cracked, but it still held light, a trembling kind of light. The sea had been restless all week, pressing against the cliffs like it wanted something back. I stood by the rocks, his maps folded in my coat pocket. They were soft from being read too many times, and that's when I saw it, the dark mouth of the tunnel, half hidden by seaweed and fog. Elias had drawn those maps years ago, back when he believed the earth beneath our home still had secrets. He'd talk about it at supper, how old smugglers carved passages into the cliffs, how maybe one led all the way under the sea. I used to laugh at him. But now, every line he drew felt like a breadcrumb. The entrance was smaller than I imagined. The stones were slick with moss, and the air smelled of rust and something old, like forgotten wood. I hesitated, listening to the sea behind me. It was low tide. If I waited, the water would rise again, and the way back would vanish. So I went in. Each step echoed. The sound of my boots felt too loud, like I was interrupting something that had been quiet for years. The walls narrowed the deeper I went. My lantern brushed against the rock, leaving a thin smear of soot. Somewhere above I could still hear gulls. But soon their cries faded, replaced by the slow drip of water and my own breathing. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe his tools. Maybe nothing at all. But the truth was, I needed to see where the lines on his map ended, because sometimes, when you love someone long enough, their ghosts start to speak through the things they've left behind. The tunnel curved, and the air grew heavy, damp, almost alive. I came to a small chamber, circular, carved with care. The floor was covered in sand, soft and white like salt. That's when I saw them. Flowers. Lilies. Pressed flat against the earth. Their petals had turned paper thin, but the scent still lingered, faint and sweet. I knelt. My fingers trembled as I touched one. It was real. Too real. Elias had promised me lilies on our wedding day. He'd tied them with a ribbon the color of the sea, and now here they were. Hidden beneath the world. My heart thudded hard enough to shake the lantern glass. I looked around, the chamber wasn't empty. There were bits of cloth, splintered wood, a broken chain, things the sea might have carried and left here like offerings. Then, something caught my eye, a dark shred clinging to a jagged stone. Reached for it. The fabric tore a little when I pulled it. Free! Wool! Blue-gray. Elias's coat, the one he wore the night he vanished. I pressed it to my face. It smelled faintly of him. Salt, tobacco, rain. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the air. It was the knowing. He'd been here, and maybe he'd never left. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the sea, a low hum carried through the stone. But it wasn't the sea. It was a voice, soft, low, humming a tune I knew too well. I froze. My lantern flickered, shadows stretching long along the walls. It was the Song Elias used to hum when he thought no one was listening, the same one he sang to me, under the lilac tree after our wedding. The sound drifted, through the tunnel, fading, then returning again, like it was moving. I turned toward it, the lantern trembling in my hand. "Elias?" I whispered. My voice came back to me in pieces. The humming stopped. Then, on a slow step, bare, another, closer. The echo crawled along the tunnel walls, slipping between the drops of water. I took a step back, the flame shrinking. The air grew colder, not with fear, but with something like memory. He used to walk barefoot after storms. Said he liked how the earth felt when it was clean again. The steps stopped. I waited. The silence pressed against my chest until it hurt. Then, from the corner of my eye, movement, a shadow on the wall. Too tall, too human. I turned sharply. The lantern flared, and the shape vanished into the curve of the tunnel. But the air still hummed, faint and steady, and I realized it wasn't coming from ahead. It was behind me. I didn't run. Something in me knew running wouldn't help. Not here, where sound carried farther than light. I stood still, listening. The humming faded again, swallowed by the sea above. I lifted the lantern one last time, its light catching the damp curve of stone. The tunnel looked endless, but I knew better. It always led back to the sea. When I turned toward the entrance, a small gust blew past me, cold and certain. The flame flickered out, darkness, complete. I felt for the wall, steadying myself, and my hand brushed something on the ground. Leather. Wet. Heavy. I reached down and felt the edge of a boot. Elias's. Both of them. Sitting by the mouth of the tunnel, like someone had carried them there carefully. I didn't pick them up. I just stood there, in the dark, listening to the faint rush of waves returning. The sea was coming back for what it was owed. And maybe for me too. The air in the tunnel had changed. It wasn't just damp anymore. It was heavy, almost breathing. My lantern cast small circles of trembling light, each one swallowed by the dark before it could reach the walls. The silence was thick, except for the soft drip of water somewhere ahead. I followed it, step by step, until the ground began to slope, and then the tunnel opened, wide, unexpected, into a cavern. At its center, a pool. Still. Black. Deep enough that even the light seemed afraid to touch it. I stood at the edge and felt the cold rise through my boots. The sea had always frightened me. Not because of its noise, but because of what it could hide. Elias loved it. He said the sea was honest, that it never took without reason. I used to believe him, but now, looking at that pool beneath the earth, I wondered if honesty and hunger were the same thing. The air smelled of salt and stone. I could hear faint echoes of the tide far above, like the heartbeat of something sleeping. I crouched by the edge. The water was so clear it reflected my face, pale, trembling, rimmed in the dim glow of the lantern. For a moment, I thought I saw another face beside mine. His. I blinked, and it was gone. I wanted to say his name out loud, to let it fill the chamber. But my throat felt sealed. Like the tunnel itself didn't want to hear it. Something brushed against the surface. A ripple. I leaned closer. There, half submerged, was a boot. The same kind that had been missing from the well. Bloated, coated in green. Floating like something that had been waiting too long. I should have turned back. But I didn't. I reached out. My fingers touched the water. It was colder than I imagined. Sharp, almost electric. The ripples spread across the pool, disturbing the perfect blackness. Then the water moved. At first, it was just a small shift, like the current turning. But then, slowly, something rose from beneath, pale and trembling. A hand. It broke the surface, dripping and silent. The skin was gray, like candle wax left too long in the sun. I froze. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and the air. The hand didn't reach for me. It didn't clutch or drag. It only lifted, one finger extended, pointing toward the far wall. The lantern trembled in my hand. Shadows danced across the rock, long and quivering, and then I saw it, carved shallowly into the stone, half covered in salt and moss. E.W. plus C.W. Elias Ward. Clara Ward. Our initials. I stepped closer, the sound of water dripping around me like slow, patient applause. I traced the letters with my fingertip. The grooves were rough, uneven, made by someone in a hurry, someone who wanted to leave a mark before something else took it away. I felt my throat tighten. He had been here, but why carve this? A memory or a warning? Behind me, the water shifted again. I turned, slowly. The hand was gone. The surface had gone still, too still. But in that silence, something felt different. Lighter, maybe. Or lonelier. I sank to my knees beside the pool. The lantern light shimmered faintly, touching the walls in soft gold strokes. He had once told me he'd never leave me without a sign. "If I can't come back," he said, "you'll know where to find me." I had laughed then. Because men like Elias didn't speak in riddles. They worked with their hands. They built. They repaired. They stayed. But this felt like his language. Simple, quiet, certain. Maybe he came here looking for a way out. Maybe he carved those letters when he realized there wasn't one. Or maybe he was leaving me a path. I leaned closer to the water again. For a moment, I thought I heard something beneath it. A hum, low and steady. The same tune he used to whistle while mending nets. It came and went like breath. And just before it faded, I thought I saw movement. Not a body, not a face, but a flicker of light deep below, like a lantern being carried away. The hum stopped. The water settled. And all I could hear was the sea above, waiting. I sat there for a long time. The air had gone colder, and the lantern's flame was shrinking, tired, like it had seen too much. The initials on the wall glimmered faintly, catching the last of the light. I reached out one last time, pressing my palm flat against them. The rock was warm, not with life, but with memory. When I stood, I looked back at the pool. The boot had drifted toward the center, circling slowly, as if drawn by something unseen. I whispered his name, not to call him, but to let it go. Then I turned, walking back through the tunnel, the lantern dimming with every step. Behind me, I heard one final sound, a single drop of water, falling, echoing, vanishing. By the time I reached the mouth of the tunnel, dawn had begun to touch the sea. And in that faint gray light, I finally understood. The sea never keeps what it loves. It only returns it in another form. Rain was falling sideways that night. The kind that doesn't sound like rain at all. Just a steady whisper against everything you thought was solid. I walked barefoot through the mud, the earth pulling at my steps like it wanted me to stay. The lantern in my hand sputtered, its flame shaking with each gust. The well stood ahead, darker than the sky, its stones slick with moss and time. For weeks, I had tried not to come back. But some things, they call you, even when you know better, and I think, deep down, I wanted it to. I'd spent the morning pretending to live, folding linens that didn't need folding, boiling water I never drank, listening to the walls creak as if they were breathing beside me. The town had grown quiet since the storm. No one came by anymore, not even the sheriff. Mavis had left a note, a single sentence. Let him rest. But rest doesn't come easy to the ones who are left behind. That night, the wind pressed, hard against the windows, bending the trees until they looked like people bowing. I sat at the table, tracing the edge of the lantern Elias had once carried. The brass was cold, dented near the base, a mark from when he'd dropped it years ago, laughing at his own clumsiness. Now, that same dent felt like a wound. When the clock struck 11, the house made a sound I'd never heard before, a low moan, like something shifting beneath the floorboards. I rose without thinking, took the lantern, and stepped out into the storm. The path to the well was almost gone, swallowed by mud and tall grass. I followed it by memory. Lightning flashed. Behind me, just long enough to make my shadow stretch across the field like something reaching back toward the house. The well's rim glistened with rain. Water overflowed, spilling down its sides like tears. I knelt, lantern in hand, and held it over the edge. The flame flickered against the darkness below. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the reflection of my own face, pale, trembling, not sure if it was mine anymore. Then I whispered his name. Elias. The water rippled, faint but certain. And in that ripple I thought I saw a light moving, deeper down, flickering like a heartbeat. I tightened my grip on the lantern. He had built it for me once, said it would burn longer than any storm. So I lifted it high, and with one last breath, I let it go. The lantern fell slowly, turning as it dropped. Its light spun against the stones, gold in the dark. Then it hit the water, a soft sound, almost kind, and as it sank, the light faded to nothing. Or maybe to somewhere else. I turned to leave, but the wind stopped. The world went still. Even the rain seemed to pause mid-air, like it was holding its breath. And then, I heard it. A voice, low and calm, carried up from the well. You found me. My knees gave out before I could think. I gripped the stones, rainwater running over my hands, my hair clinging to my face. Elias? Silence. Just the echo of my own voice falling back into the dark. But I swear, I felt it. A warmth rising from the well. Like breath. I leaned closer, searching for the light I'd thrown away. And that's when I saw it. The water was gone. Drained, as if the earth had swallowed it whole. At the bottom, between jagged stones, was an opening. A tunnel, narrow and black, leading somewhere I couldn't see. I wiped the rain from my eyes. My own reflection wavered at the edge, the last thing left between me and the dark below. The air from the opening smelled like salt and iron, like something ancient waiting. I thought of what Mavis had said, that the sea takes what it's owed. Maybe Elias hadn't been taken. Maybe he'd gone where he thought he belonged. Morning came soft and gray. The storm had passed, leaving the field scattered with broken branches and half-buried stones. The well stood dry for the first time in years. Its bottom glimmered faintly in the early light, as if still remembering the lantern's glow. I stood at its edge, my hands still cold from the night. Somewhere down there, past the silence and the stone, was the truth, or whatever was left of it. I leaned forward, just enough to see my reflection again. It didn't move this time, didn't ripple, just watched me, waiting. The wind shifted. A whisper rose from below. Not a word, not a sound, just the feeling of being called. I took one slow step closer, and I wondered, would I climb down or let the past finally sink beneath the water?